gay bite in Brooklyn. You and I are cooking, feeling so good looking.
Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz Interview Series with Grammy-winning jazz multi-instrumentalist and podcaster Leo Sidran. He talked to us about his 2021 CD, The Art of Conversation, and so much more. This project was hatched prior to the pandemic, but really gained steam as 2020 arrived and inspiration took hold. Over COVID, he settled into domestic life and set about writing a collection of songs that offered an intimate look into family life during the pandemic. This very personal album is his 7th solo album and follows in the tradition of his earlier releases for being raw and powerful. He is also a very influential podcaster of The Third Story, featuring conversations with musicians and members of the creative world. We delved our way into a great conversation about this CD, his world, music, COVID, and the future that is happening right before our eyes. Enjoy.
Good to hear from you. What a nice surprise to get that email yesterday.
Oh, man, when I saw your CD, I was like, I have to talk to him about this.
So great.
Yeah, it is, man. And, you know, the thing about it is, and I'm sure you've been really kind of inundated with doing a lot of things during this quarantine, but I've talked to so many musicians, and now that the dust is kind of settling somewhat, it's so nice to talk to everybody kind of on the other side. And this project just sounds like such a nice audio gumbo you've put together to kind of cathartically heal what we've all been traumatized by.
Well, I couldn't ask for a better review and summary than that, but I totally agree with you that I feel like we're all emerging out of our little caves, right? We've all been in our little caves of isolation, and now it's like everybody's coming out with their hands, bundles in their arms to show what they made during the year that they were alone and by themselves.
You know, the one thing I remember during this time, there's been several quotes that I've remembered. I remember Al Di Meola around April when this was all beginning and we didn't know where we were going. We were all on this, fortnight thing where, okay, in 2 weeks, let's see what's up. And I remember at one point he said, it's all like the planet got cancer and we all got diagnosed. We all have to absorb the fact that we have it. Then we have to figure out how to treat it, go through remission, and then emerge. And it was so profound. And then I also remember Jeff Gold, who put that wonderful book together, and he said, I'd hate to look back on this time of my life and think that it was wasted time. And I've thought about that because at the end of the day, no matter what happens, this pandemic had a monopoly on all of this, and we all had to choose. Are we going to emerge, or are we not going to emerge?
That's exactly right. And at the same time, I allowed myself, and I think I learned that making use of your time doesn't necessarily mean being frantic, and being chaotically trying to achieve as much as possible. I think also this kind of the slowness of it in a way was really, for me anyway, came right at the right time in my life to just realize that that's productive time too. Slowness is productive.
You're totally right. And I think too, one of the things that I read about the album is, you get reconnected with your children and domestic life and things. We go through life saying the most important thing is family, but families can't have a really long time after a pregnancy and a birth and all of these things. It's like we say it, but we don't do it. But nature forced us through this virus to finally do it.
No kidding. I mean, that's the amazing thing, is that it was awful. There were so many aspects of it that were awful, not least of which was the enormous loss of life and the sickness and the pain and the uncertainty and the economic turmoil. I mean, there's so many things, but there is also kind of beauty, and unquestionably for me, the time with my immediate family, with my wife and daughter, was so special. And I can't help but feeling that I will look back on this with affection and nostalgia.
The one thing I noticed too during this pandemic is that there were a lot of musicians and a lot of really bright individuals that are always constantly busy that got a chance to slow down. And I got to wonder on this album, was this a byproduct of the fact that there were a lot of people that had the chance to slow down and you were able to marionette that together?
Yeah, I mean, on some level, yes, because when I made this album, it primarily is a solitary work. It's, at the core of it, it's me in my little studio at home just doing what I do. But at the same time, I knew that pretty much everybody was grounded. Everybody was at home. Most of the musicians who I know that didn't already have a little home setup, good microphone and a computer setup, most of them kind of invested in it right away. And so I knew that pretty much everybody was able to record at home. And, nobody was going to tell me that they were on the road or in the middle of a tour or anything. So in a sense, I did have the feeling that it was a good time to reach out to people. And also at the beginning of the pandemic and, in the first sort of 6 months, the energy that I was getting from most of the musical people in my life was just, let's do something. Let's create. That need to create, that compulsion that we have is so strong that a lot of the kind of normal factors that go into it, the money and the, whatever, how's it going to be used and what are we doing? Are we making it for a purpose? Any of that stuff went out the window, and we were all just kind of just sharing ideas with each other just to do something, just to be, creative and productive.
At the heart of an artist, it's all about inspiration. And I think we've had these, in our age group, we had 9/11, we had the shuttle explosion when we were kids. There's these flashpoints. But we've always looked at the 60s and the revolution. I can't imagine a more profound time in the history of human beings than to go through a pandemic, and then we have a race war that turned into a class war, that turned into a political war. I mean, if anybody that has an artistic bone in their body didn't get inspired by this last year to somehow regurgitate that, this was the time to shine.
You are speaking my language here. I have always felt we did have 9/11, and it's not that we haven't lived through some significant historical moments. We certainly have. But I guess particularly for those of us who grew up with a real awareness of the 60s and what that represented culturally, politically, socially, I always felt that I was born in 76. I felt like I belonged to a generation that was a little bit in the middle and didn't belong to the 60s and the sort of post-60s generation in the 70s. And also later on seeing millennials and seeing kids who grew up with the internet and how that was a real force for change, in the way they see the world. I felt that those of us who sort of came of age in the 80s and 90s really belonged to a kind of a driftless generation. And I absolutely felt this year for the first time that it wasn't intellectual, it wasn't theoretical, it was a reality that we were living through history. And in fact, unlike the 60s, which was, I think, to some extent nationally specific, culturally specific, all over the world, there was change and upheaval and turmoil in the 60s. But really, when we think about the 60s, at least when I think about them, I'm thinking about the 60s in America in response to Vietnam and the civil rights movement and all of that. Whereas, as you say, this is a thing this year with COVID that took over the entire planet. We all we have a shared solidarity because everybody who's alive today has lived through this thing. So, and yes, then in the United States, what happened with Black Lives Matter, and let's not forget that when this whole thing started, Donald Trump was our president. We are still clearly very traumatized from that. There really was a sense that this is an important moment, and whatever the work is that comes out of it is a byproduct or a document of that. And I felt that when I was making this.
The other flashpoint that I think that was very evident that I realized very deep about this too was that, a lot of people talked about the frontline workers when this happened. We talked about the nurses and the grocery store workers and food service, which was totally, absolutely applicable. But I realized that you're in a unique position as a musician and an interview host that at this point in our lives, if we don't realize the magnitude of the live arts and music and just having the chance to turn on Netflix and all this would have been an unbelievably dark period in American history if we couldn't have gotten ourselves immersed in art.
I agree with you, and I think that you sort of have these two somewhat opposing forces when it comes to the arts in the last year, because the economic mechanism for the arts really came to a halt, right? Like, So we learned and we understand more deeply how tenuous it is, how unstable it is. I mean, anybody in the arts already knew that it was a very risky business to try to make a living in the arts. And this year it all just sort of came to a halt. So we learned how delicate that is. But at the same time, while it was hard to make money in the arts, you know, there was no live performance to speak of, I also came to feel that the role of the arts and the artists and culture creators, culture brokers, cultural commentators, all of it is maybe more significant than I ever realized. And I don't in any way mean to like inflate what we do as musicians to say that it's saving lives necessarily, although I do think that it brings some meaning in a way that we might not have realized before.
You know, there was a musician that I spoke with last week that said music is something that I've had on constantly over this last year, and it's really actually pulled me through. I think there is a lot of, you know, sageness to that, because I think, I mean, I'm in the same boat. When this happened, I remember it was like the 13th of March. I think it was a Friday the 13th, and I remember when I realized, like the night before, I was sitting in my son's room, I was putting him to bed, and I was watching a hockey game, just got him weaned on watching the Blues, and I'm sitting there, and I just realized this is over with. Like, it was a moment of clarity where I knew I was thankful that I ran around like crazy with my family and kids and did things, because it was going away for I don't know how long it was. But I remember that next morning I woke up and I was listening to the radio, and the blood was just pulsing to my ears, and I said, what am I going to do? And at that point, I decided I'm going to go gung-ho, and I'm going to talk to musicians, and I'm going to really get in there, and I'm going to do it with therapeutic and cathartic, I think, overall before this. And I think it's talking to people, and I think it's the art of conversation and just being in tune. Did you feel like this was a moment for you to say, you know what, I have a choice to make?
Well, I did something similar. I mean, the first thing is that I had this, you know, you and I have this in common, that we clearly benefit personally from talking to artists and people that we admire, and then we share it publicly, and other people, you know, glean what they glean from it. But I suspect that you, like me, are just compelled to do it for very personal reasons. And one difference is that I had always sort of insisted that I do my interviews in person. You know, I had really gone out of my way to be in the room. I somehow convinced myself that I wasn't able to have real connection with people if I wasn't in the room. I know it's not true. I mean, I went back and I listened to the conversation that you and I had 3 years ago. Last night I went back and listened to it, and I realized how revelatory it was, and it's a phone call. So clearly you don't have to be in the room with somebody. But the first thing that happened with me on March 13th was I started picking up the phone and calling people. I mean, it immediately called people all over the world. And it dawned on me in that first day or two when I started making episodes about what was happening to people during COVID, that this was a real opportunity to document it in my little way. And yes, I was completely pulled to it. I mean, it was like frantic. I did more podcasts in the last year than I, you know, certainly had done in the previous years, although I didn't have much else to do for a while. So it was a really good use of time.
Certainly. You know, the one thing I realized over this time was I always did this, you know, my son and my stepdaughter, you know, I never really did it in front of them because, you know, it's just, it's like you said, you want to have the personal touch, and where I'm at and how I live my life, phone calls make sense. But I started putting this on speaker for them because there was nothing else to do. And it was so beautiful that they could hear and feel not only the love that I have for what I'm doing, but more importantly, the vigor and conviction and love that all these musicians had. And I would say over that time period, when it was really, we were in the soup, those musicians were overwhelmingly positive, and I think psychologically they did so many good things, not only for my kids listening, but for the world that was listening, because there is that positivity. There is that survival. It's the essence of improv that is the backbone of this jazz world.
I totally agree. You know, one of the questions that I was asking people at the beginning of the pandemic was, are we as jazz musicians more qualified to handle something like this? You know, and is it because of our understanding of improvisation, our familiarity with responding to whatever is happening? You know, and I sort of had a more high-minded or, you know, conceptual idea that somehow being familiar with improvisation would prepare us for the unknown. But one of the great answers I got was from the saxophone player John Ellis, who said, it's just that we're used to hustling. I mean, maybe it's not even about the music. It's just knowing that you're always going to have to kind of reinvent yourself from month to month. And this is just another example of that.
Yeah, and that's the thing I was wondering in the beginning too. That's the nature. I think because of this pandemic, I've realized the spontaneity of jazz, and this is how I conceptualize it. Everything I look at anymore, I know it's going to happen absolutely one time. So no matter how many times a Las Vegas act goes on stage and tries to recreate that magic, all of the times Tom Jones, all of the times that Louis Anderson, whoever it was, they were never going to do that again.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that I love about jazz. And even when I think about someone like Sonny that never likes to do recordings in the studio, he wants it live because he gets that. That's why he went on that bridge and he blew that horn, because he knew he didn't need an audience. And I actually heard from Henry Robinette told me this story, and he said that after 9/11 happened, Sonny Rollins was just in the backdrop of somebody getting interviewed, and no one knew it was him. And he's playing his horn while everybody's going through this shock and tragedy of what's going on around him. Sonny's blowing his horn, and the interviewer goes up and doesn't know it's Sonny and interviews Sonny. And says, wow, you're out here blowing your horn, and he just had that Sonny wisdom, man, like a jazz Jedi council leader. He just laid it out. No one knew it was him, and he walked off into the fog. And how beautiful is that,
That's kind of it. And as you say, that it's going to happen once, and it disappears into the atmosphere, kind of like smoke, wafting away in the air. And it also speaks to one of the questions I think that came up this year around live streaming and, trying to channel the energy of live performance in the internet space, because there was a lot of live streaming. I mean, I was tuning into Smalls Live at 5 p.m., pretty much every day. I would sort of have it on in the background. It was something really powerful about knowing that right now on the planet, these cats are playing this music, even if they're just playing in an empty room. But interestingly, all of those are documented for the future also. They sort of happen in real time, but they also happen as these kind of recorded documents. And so it's a way of it was a way of sort of tapping into the spirit of live music, but also it's not exactly the same. That's one thing where I think it just is not the same, even though you're watching it in real time. But what it reminds me of is that last summer I went home to Wisconsin to stay with my parents for a month, and my dad and I got into the habit of watching the Smalls Lives in the late afternoon in Wisconsin a few days in a row. And what I realized is I had a very different experience just watching the live streams with him. And I realized that it was the communion of being in the room with somebody else who was watching this live at the same time go down that made me feel differently about it. It's one thing to sort of sit at home in my isolation and do it, but as soon as somebody else was doing it with me, it was like, I don't know, there was some feeling of, you're hearing this too, right? We're responding in synchronicity, and it did change the experience for me.
It's almost like being in the middle of that circle when the Beatles were singing about love. It's like we all had that moment where Paul McCartney slipped that piece of paper to Bob Dylan that had the meaning of life, and we all lost it and had to remember what it was. But what it is, it's really about this social communal aspect of what we're doing. And all of the musicians I talk to, that's what they say. It's that act, because when we see them on stage, it's like an athlete. Their game face is on. They're not letting in. They need us. And we need them because we're buying tickets for them. So that interchange is so important. And when we get to that moment, I think it's that post 9/11 moment we wanted to stretch forever. We have to have that empathy for each other as humans and for the artistic process, but we have to do it together. Like you sitting with your father, the history that you two have, and just knowing that he's there with you, and in this world that we didn't know where it was going to go, you could rely on that and share what you love with them. Yeah,
no question. And also, though, what you say speaks to another question that I have been thinking about this year, tying back to the earlier conversation today about the role of the arts, the importance of the arts. You say that you've heard from people who say that music got them through. Music is important, the arts are important, but it does take place in a dialogue with the listener and with the audience. It is a conversation. On the one hand, we all had the opportunity to go inward and reflect and be quiet and introspective and work emerged out of it. I made a record out of it, which is a very internal, personal look at my life, because I wasn't getting a lot of external feedback from the rest of the world, so I had myself and my own life to look at. But on the other hand, it really wouldn't mean the same thing if I weren't then able to bring it out to the world and have a conversation with an audience about it. That's the role of the arts, is to kind of help to foster a dialogue between the artist and the audience, the creator and the listener.
I remember when you say Smalls, I had a conversation with Spike probably around August, and he had his family with him. It was chaotic, but he wanted to talk, and I could hear it.
Yeah.
And I could hear the pain of him not knowing if things were going to close up at that time. Renters were, really on their way out. Landlords were kind of forced. And when I got Aliens and Wizards last week and played it, it's one of those moments where I really kind of sprung a leak. I really got emotional because I saw all those cats smiling on that album cover. He came through it. They're doing live shows. And it's like, I think that's the thing about all this. If we've been awake through this and we've paid attention, I think there's been some major things that have happened that wouldn't necessarily be on a quote-unquote Sports Center highlight reel, but just in the annals of human beings doing what we always have wanted to do from those little quotes that we've read as kindergartners. We did something that was right and good, and we made it through.
Yeah, and then, you think about just the Herculean effort that it takes anyway to keep a jazz club going, and it's almost an affliction that Spike suffers from, that he is so committed to it, because he's you could just feel, as you say, you could feel the energy coming off of him all year, the kind of panic and concern and determination to keep the club open, and fear that it was, hanging by a thread. And in the midst of all of that, to then go out and make a record of his own, it just shows how crazy you have to be. What a kind of a strange sickness it is that we all suffer from.
Well, it's the crazy people that save us, man, from the people that called Jesus a heretic to the people that call the modern day Marvel something that's not right. So, the way I like to approach artistic things, because I come from a pure listener standpoint, and I don't tend to needle into specifics of songs, but I do want to get into the vibe. And it sounds like from you, there's been this admiration for this time to a certain degree. Is this album a love letter to this era that you will never forget?
I have a lot of feelings when you say that. I mean, the first thing is that a big part of the record was kind of starting to be in motion before COVID. In fact, the songs that you would expect emerged out of COVID. There are songs like Trying Times and Row On, which is like kind of a song about hope and optimism and solidarity, and Pop, which is a very personal, family, inward-looking song, and This Is Night in Brooklyn, which is a kind of a quiet little ode to my neighborhood. Those are all songs that were written just before COVID. And then there are other songs that came after COVID that are kind of the groovier, more up-tempo, more fun tunes. I mean, that's not true totally across the board, but in general, it doesn't play by the rules that you might expect when you listen to it. So it is definitely a love letter to this time. And on the other hand, I keep asking myself, man, well, what would the response have been to these very same songs if COVID hadn't come and I put this record out? Would it have somehow seemed tone deaf and too introspective and quiet? It just kind of aligned in that way, which has really forced me to ask another question that I never asked about the role of songwriters and writers in general, because I have often been cautious about the idea of artists as being other than, or separate from, or in touch with anything that everyone else is in touch with. But what I do think happens is that what our job is, whether it's as an instrumentalist or a songwriter or whatever it is to kind of reach into the atmosphere. I mean, really reach into the thin air around us and pull something out of it that is processed through our own bodies and our own experiences, and then we put it back into the atmosphere. And somehow by kind of funneling it through ourselves, maybe we have something to say, we have something to contribute. And I ultimately feel like for some reason I was just like tuned into an energy right before COVID that really speaks to this year. So it's not exactly a love letter in that sense that you're asking, because so much of this material was coming out of me before this period began.
So to follow up with that, I think the one thing about this time that we've gone through with COVID is it's been a big mirror. It's been a big, time of self-reflection. What did you learn about yourself that you didn't realize until this came around?
I mean, my first thought when you say that, and again, I don't mean to sugarcoat everything, but I realized that my personal happiness is not a function of so many of the factors that I thought it was. I mean, I found myself pretty happy waking up. I had a reason to get out of bed every morning. I wanted to make music. I wanted to be with my family. I wanted to make another podcast episode. I had anxiety about not being able to see my parents and some of my friends, but I actually found that I was pretty happy, and that my happiness and my ability to be happy is not determined by so many of the external factors that I thought it was. That's the first thing I think I learned about myself.
The one thing that I think about is for musicians, there's a lot of things that I've heard about how, revenue share and having more control over things has been kind of like things that have come out of musicians. I'm wondering how you think the jazz community at large is going to emerge stronger when we kind of get back to it in earnest.
I think that there's a sense that maybe this is Europe after the war, or it's the 1920s, or it's it's New York City in 1979, or it's going to be one of these fertile creative times when both the artists and the audiences kind of realize what they've been missing, or that they need each other. And I think that maybe that's true. I think maybe more likely what it is that sometimes systems need to be dismantled in order to change, to grow, to find what the next thing is. And although we are lamenting the loss of so many clubs, which is really a horrible tragedy, and so many opportunities, I do think we have to remember that it wasn't really a super robust business. 2 years ago, if you talk to most musicians, they probably would have complained that there wasn't more opportunity to make money and more opportunity to get their music out there, and that there was a glut of product out there, and that it's hard. So in a sense, I think maybe this is a chance for a kind of rebuilding of the whole infrastructure of the way we experience live music.
There was a drummer that I interviewed that was in Berlin, and he had kind of pointed something out to me in a very stark way and said, lots of these things that have come to light, like our political inequities and the racial problems, we were already a car kind of on the cliff. Like you're saying about the clubs, there's levels of this that didn't just kind of happen because a virus ravaged the planet. It was there before, but we all needed to have a reason. Like last summer after the George Floyd killing, there was riots everywhere. And I'm thinking, man alive, we're in the middle of a raging pandemic. But you know what? At that point, we had been in our houses for like 3.5 months. And most of the people that were out there had lost jobs and didn't have money. So what did they have to lose? What did they care? And I keep thinking about levels of that, like we've talked about, like these, for our generation, having a very deep thing that's happening. We watched a lot of this unfold right in front of our eyes.
Yeah, totally. And well, I live in Brooklyn. I know all over the country it was happening. It was certainly happening here, where people were taking to the streets, and particularly during the protests, Black Lives Matter protests. I mean, what was interesting was that we knew often people who politically agreed with science, agreed with wearing masks, agreed that it was important to maintain social distancing, that we're not denying any of the science. They were still compelled to gather in groups, often safely. I mean, I think it was really amazing that there wasn't an enormous amount of community spread of the virus during those marches, and it was because people wore their masks. But I thought it was interesting that politically the will was there. It was so strong to gather when something was, compelling enough, that we took to the streets and we went out and we marched. I mean, it was incredible to take my daughter out on, a few of those sort of family-friendly marches around Prospect Park in Brooklyn. It was powerful, and it reminded us how important it is to gather and be together.
So when we do return in earnest to the stage, I'm in the audience, you're on stage. What do you hope we all realize about the power of live music that's been gone for so long?
I don't know. My dad and I have been having a lot of conversations around this, and he's been sort of saying, I sort of belong to this sort of family tradition. I mean, where his point of view has often been from the stage that it's a radical act to feel good, that it is a kind of human right to gather like this in these small spaces and, huddle around the fire of this music. And, he and I have been talking a lot about whether or not that message still resonates in the same way. Do we want to come out of this experience just saying, let's feel good, or are we supposed to have a different message that we express to the audience? I don't have an answer to that, what I want people to feel. I mean, the power of togetherness, the power of community, yes, but I have to be honest with you, I don't know how it's going to feel. I've been to a couple of concerts in the last week as a spectator. I can tell you what that felt like. I was at the Beacon Theater last week for a mega concert of incredible artists performing at the top of their game, and it was inspirational, much like you describe watching athletes. I mean, it was like watching some of the most unbelievable practitioners of the craft, and it was inspirational, remembering just the potential of human expression. But I also went around the corner to a little club in my neighborhood last week and sat outside while a kind of impromptu little jam session took place. And in some ways, that was more meaningful to me because it felt more tied to real life. This is music happening on the corner. This is people gathering because they need to, because they want to be together and they want to share it. And that, in a way, that's what I responded to more immediately.
Ultimately, at the end of the day, when someone downloads or buys this album, what do you hope they get from this artistic expression of yours?
I hope that in some way my personal little experience, that they connect to it, that they feel that it's about them in some way also. There's that old adage that the personal is universal, and I hope that people feel that this is, all I have is my own experience to share, but I hope that they feel in some way that maybe it reflects a little piece of them too.
Beautiful. Leo, hey, thank you, man, for opening up. I love you and your dad, man. You guys, I can tell your bond's strong. What you both do for jazz as musicians and practitioners of keeping this flame alive is always inspirational. So thank you for taking time out for making the world just a brighter place for jazz, man.
Well, I feel the same way. I feel that we are kindred spirits, man, and we are, like I said, I think we are pulled by a very similar magnet to do these things, whether or not you're a musician or a listener or, whatever you are, a documenter of this history. And I feel both privileged to be documented by you and also to be kind of part of the same crew of people who are out here trying to capture a little of it.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest cats in Wisconsin, Brooklyn, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Leo for his time and his honesty. It's always a pleasure to catch up with him, to get his take on what's going on in the world of jazz that he always makes stronger. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit Neon Jazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz all the time, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
In Brooklyn, in Brooklyn.
Neon Jazz.